All right, and so here we go. The moment we've all been waiting for, being able to put the election perhaps in a little bit of perspective, and so that's what I want to try to do in dialogue with you today. And I really hope you'll bring your questions, your concerns, your observations. And the reason I hope that is because, in a sense, anybody who says we have enough information to understand what just happened in this election, I think is making a mistake. Not only is the only information we have on the one hand the outcome of a bunch of elections, but not yet enough to know actually who controls Congress, but also the more fine-grained information comes from exit polls, and exit polls are not great polls, and they're actually getting worse in the sense that more and more of us are voting by mail or not in person. And so that means we don't have a chance to come up with a clipboard and catch you at the polling station. And it was the case that there was a little bit more, I think, honesty, accountability, candor in that kind of polling situation where you were face to face after you had just voted than there is in the kind of standard telephone-based poll. But now exit polls are increasingly just like other polls. So all that to say, and I'm going to start with this. I think any really strong reading of any election a few days after it's occurred is a mistake. I think, in a sense, any strong reading of any election is often a mistake. And certainly yesterday's election, which still, I'm sorry, Tuesday's election, which still has not been fully decided and about which we have very limited information, that applies in spades. And having said that, I hope you will allow me to start with my political philosopher's hat on and point out that we should be very careful not to fully equate election results with public opinion. And in saying that, I'll start with a distinction, and that is between, on the one hand, political behavior, and in particular, the kind of electoral behavior that decides the outcome of elections, and on the other hand, public opinion. And so behavior, I filled out a ballot, like I'm sure many of you did a while ago. Did that ballot give me the opportunity to say exactly what I would say in conversation with you about American politics today? No, obviously not, right? Our choice is between two different parties and the candidates they've put forward based in part on how people voted in primaries, but also in the primary before the primary, the funding primary. And so opinion, judgment, belief is a much more subtle and at the same time a much deeper propositional thing than behavior, right? And what an election captures is electoral behavior, not public opinion. So one reason not to read too much into yesterday is that we don't have great information about it. I keep saying yesterday, Tuesday. But the other reason is because viewing majority votes in occasional elections as an accurate or decisive measure of public opinion, it seems to me, is a mistake. It's a mistake that we have strong institutional and ideological incentives to commit. Institutionally, on the one hand, people who win elections want to claim that that reflects where the public's judgment resides in order to be able to translate victory into legitimacy and power. And on the other hand, we have a whole class of persons, we sometimes call it the chattering class, the talking heads, people in the media, people like me who spend a lot of time analyzing politics, who are supposed to be able to read the tea leaves to discern the meaning of these events. And I want to suggest that leads us perhaps to overanalyze or to read too much into elections. And so please note that what I'm saying is please take everything I'm about to say with a grain of salt, right? And try to avoid this fallacy, even as at the same time we try to figure out what kind of meaning we can attribute to the election that just occurred. So let me go into a little bit of detail about why I think we have to be careful not to equate electoral behavior with public opinion. The first reason is that there are a lot of factors that shape electoral behavior that don't necessarily shape public opinion. So the type of election and party system we have, right, an electoral system that for the vast majority of us lets us choose only between two candidates and two parties. The way in which we organize our elections tends to produce a two-party system that's formulated actually as a law of political science, Derviche's law, that the territorially based one-member districts that we have produce one-party systems, right? Alaska is going to ranked choice. Maine has ranked choice. There are some variations, but dominantly we have the kind of electoral systems that produce a two-party system. Two-party systems gives you two choices. When was the last time you were fully identified with the candidate of one party? You said that person believes everything I believe. And frankly, if you ever were in that situation, it's probably because you're following the candidate where the candidate suggests you should go, as opposed to the idea that you made up your mind independently about what you think and then you found the perfect candidate. That rarely happens. Second reason that we should think there's some distance between electoral behavior and public opinion has to do with the quality of information and discourse present in the media and the public sphere. Do we treat the election primarily as a horse race, a sports competition, a strategic exercise to see who wins the election and who gets to exercise power? That's important. Don't get me wrong. You know, I certainly, like the rest of us, care about who wins elections. But do the conversations we have around elections allow us to have a meaningful, wide-ranging, open, deliberative discussion of the most important issues facing the country? And to be as clear as possible, part of what I've been trying to do with you over the last, I think it's 7 weeks now, is to suggest, no, we can have a deeper, more wide-ranging conversation about the most urgent issues facing us. But part of the reason we're doing that is because we don't expect our politicians to actually conduct that kind of conversation as they build up to the campaign. That's not the partisan, the media, or the climate of public opinion formation that characterizes American democracy in the 21st century. Never mind the disinformation, the scare tactics, the outright lies, right? And so public opinion only emerges from critical discourse. There's rather little critical discourse surrounding elections in America these days. Third, what are the issues, and do they evoke a deliberative disposition from the voters or not? And I do want to suggest that in 2022, there may have been a bit more on the ballot or at stake in these elections that pulled out of the voters, that evoked in us a more deliberative stance. And that is closely related to a fourth and final issue. And I may sound quaint talking about the ethics of citizenship. Maybe it's better to just talk about political identities. But I want to suggest that there's a really essential aspect of the way we think about what we're doing as we make up our minds about how to vote and what to think politically. And that is right? We may have certain principles which we have become convinced of and don't think we're going to hear an argument from a politician in the course of an election cycle that will change our minds about those principles. The nature of political justice, the character of democracy, the kinds of equality and freedom and mutual respect and concern that justice and democracy require are, let us assume for the moment, not up for grabs in each election cycle. But what is hopefully up for grabs is what those deep, abiding political convictions require of us in this moment in terms of the policies we should support and the politicians who are closest to those policy preferences. And what that means is that we have to be open to and responsive to evidence and discourse. It has to be part of our political identity that we make up our minds election by election on the basis of who is able to marshal persuasive evidence that their policies work or respond to the salient features of our world, who is able to marshal argument that persuades us that they have the right way of articulating our convictions into policy at this historical moment. And that means, right, that we're not just dyed-in-the-wool partisans before the election begins, that we're not letting our identities dictate where we stand with regards to matters of fact and argument. If that's not the case, and I think that hasn't been the case for the majority of American voters for quite a while, then the mechanisms that shape electoral behavior are not even aiming to influence public opinion. We're in a different kind of election at that point than the kind of election that might even shape public opinion. So having said all that, I think we then have to account for why it is that it's so plausible to confuse elections for serious statements of where the public stands in terms of its views, its beliefs, its judgment. And so the impression that elections generate accountability, I think, is mainly an illusion, but it's an understandable illusion. When I say it's an illusion, I think one of the things I would point out is that there's just this whole body of political science literature that shows that politicians at the national level are not very responsive to what ordinary people think, right? As a matter of fact, not at all responsive. That elections don't lead parties and partisan leaders, for the most part, to change their views about policy issues so much as to change their tactics for mobilizing voters to vote, right? And so when they lose an election, they're not interpreting it as a reason to change their policy position or to change their stance on matters of principle. They're just tinkering with their get out the vote operation or their media operation, et cetera. So why do we have this illusion that elections generate accountability and are meaningful exercises in public opinion formation? I'm sorry to throw a whole bunch of cold water on an outcome of an election. Probably many of us are relieved turned out this way. But I think we have to be honest before we start analyzing the election about not overestimating how confident or how meaningful we should be in terms of what we ascribe to the election's results. So voting is a formal right. It's there in the law, right? And frankly, it's one of the very few formal rights that we have that allow us to feel politically empowered and impactful. It is exercised through a specific act. You fill out the ballot on a specific date, right? And so it has this almost ritualistic aspect about it, and it directly translates into a formal expression of popular will. We know what the outcome was. We can say 49-49 in the Senate, right? And that shows what the people of the United States chose in 2022. And it, right, determines the composition of legislative bodies that exercise a lot of authority, coercive authority. They make laws, and that has great symbolic importance to us as well. So all of that leads us to want to see elections as mechanisms for public opinion formation. But I want to be as clear as possible about this. The channeling of empowered political participation. How do we as citizens influence politics exclusively into this very narrow, very constrained exercise of voting secures only an illusion of political efficacy or influence and not meaningful accountability. And so, right, elections are central exercises of democracy, but by themselves far from sufficient in securing meaningful accountability. The value of the equal vote, I would suggest, is primarily expressive. It does, right, matter who gets to vote. I don't want to say that that doesn't matter, and it matters for who our politicians are and what they get to do. If a class of persons is excluded, it certainly makes it less likely that their interests are going to be accounted for. But having said that, I think the fundamental importance of voting is expressive. It's a way of saying you are a full and equal citizen. And the overall question then is empirical and variable. Do elections allow us to discern where public opinion is trending, what people actually think or not? And I think we have to have an open mind about what 2022 means as we get into an analysis of it. So let us now start the analysis. And I don't know, maybe somebody can check their phone and see if we've got an update from Nevada. As of 20 minutes ago, when I last did that, there were not new tranches of ballots being counted. And so we're at 49-49 right now. And as goes Nevada, well, if the Democrats win, then the Democrats will have control of the Senate, thanks to the vice president casting the tying vote, irrespective of what happens in Georgia. Of course, Georgia was deadlocked, a slight advantage in terms of overall votes to the current Senator Warnock, but not getting over the 50% threshold to avoid a runoff. So Herschel Walker and Warnock will go to a runoff, which will be decided next month. Second time in a row that Georgia's had to go to runoffs. Of course, the previous one had 2 senators in it. This time only 1 senator, but it may not matter for control of the Senate if Nevada goes to the Democrats. The House of Representatives, still not officially decided. Still, I think some tiny little chance that the Democrats could actually get to 218. But having said that, that would be kind of a miracle inside of a miracle, right? It would require everything to break for their direction in an election in which everything is already broken in their direction. Please remember what I said to you last week in thinking about how to analyze these elections, which is if we did a simple electoral prediction model based on the fundamentals, right? How is the economy doing? How do people think the economy is doing? Who is in power? What happens when that group is in power? What is the president's approval rating? What does that mean about the approval of his party? We should have expected the Republicans to pick up 40 to 50 seats, maybe even as many as 60 seats, some models suggest, in the House of Representatives. That obviously did not happen. They're fighting to pick up 5 or 10 seats, right? And so, you know, this was on the assumption that it was a normal election supposed to be a red wave election, as opposed to that, Democrats did better in a midterm election than any time since 1962 for their party, any time since 2002 for either party. So you're talking about having to go back 20 to 60 years for the incumbent party to have done this well in a midterm election. It is surprising, to say the least. And so part of what we need to try to sort out today is what exactly happened to determine this. I'll provide a little bit of initial information, a bunch of questions, and then some effort to try to make sense of this. So let's, before we get into the national picture, look a little bit at the state picture. And as you can see, the Democrats picked up a couple of seats in terms of gubernatorial races. They also swung a couple of state legislatures. Structurally, one of the things I think we should be paying a lot of attention to since, I guess, at least 2010 is so-called trifectas, right? And that is where one party controls both houses of the state legislature, assuming it's bicameral, and the governorship, which means essentially that party rules without a check, especially if they get a veto-proof majority, especially if they control the state Supreme Court and the state Attorney General's office. They can do whatever they want. And what we're seeing is that there's been a reduction in the number of Republican trifecta states, right? They had 23. I don't think we know exactly how many they'll have at the end of all the counting, but it appears that they've lost at least a couple, and a pickup of 4 Democratic trifectas: Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, not North Carolina, but Michigan, right? And this matters for 2 reasons, right? The loss of Republican trifecta states prevents them from gerrymandering. That's why I said we go back to 2010, which is when this red map initiative occurred in the Republican Party, an effort to really concentrate on state level power to then be able to draw the districts for both the state house and the congressional districts, and then use gerrymandering to secure power for at least the next decade, or hopefully in perpetuity, hopefully from the Republican point of view. And so they're less enabled to do that as a result of this election. Positively, those 4 Democratic pickups, there's a headline I like on this: did the red wave get overwhelmed by a green wave? And I think that would be exaggerating the extent to which people focused on climate change or environmental issues in this election. But I think one thing is really important to note here: climate change remains the single most urgent issue in the world today. And with the Republicans almost certainly having won control over the House of Representatives, I don't expect that we're going to get much meaningful climate action out of the federal government anymore. The fact that the Republicans have such a narrow minority in the House, have probably not regained control of the Senate, means that it's going to be very hard for them to even try to roll back anything in the Inflation Reduction Act, which has all these incentives to try to bring emissions down. But having said that, we certainly shouldn't expect action coming out of Washington. It's worth noting that some of the most meaningful climate legislation that has been enacted in the United States in the last decade has been enacted at the state level: California, Oregon, Washington, New York. These are states that have really led the way. And I anticipate, I hope this is right, that states like Maryland and Massachusetts, maybe Minnesota and Michigan, may start to become more aggressive at the state level about climate change. And that would be obviously a good thing. So structurally, a shift in terms of who holds power at the state level and what is likely to be done with it. Then let's go back to the primarily national level and ask, how did election deniers fare? And as you know, I think I showed you the data on this, the majority of Republican candidates for national and state office had in some way or another endorsed the idea that the 2020 election was unreliable at least, and perhaps stolen at worst, right? And about 220 of those candidates won, and they won in a variety of respects, but especially for Congress, for the House of Representatives. And there it's worthwhile noting, the vast majority who won were incumbents in deep red states who were not strong election deniers, right? And so they might have voted against certifying the results from Arizona. They might have cast some doubt on whether the election was correctly decided, but they were not out there saying the election was stolen. Of the first time candidates for Congress, most of the election deniers actually lost, right? And so please note, incumbents have a real upper hand in winning re-election in general, in terms of funding, in terms of name recognition, in terms of usually coming out of safe districts because our districts are so gerrymandered. And so to say that the 220 who won election are necessarily winning election on that basis, I think is a mistake, right? The 120 who lost, I think that is worth emphasizing, especially since a larger proportion of them, right, about 40%, were strong deniers of the election, really saying that it was stolen. Only 16% of those who won were strong deniers of the election. And as you can see, it's just a smattering of first-time candidates for Congress who are strong election deniers who won. Similarly, at the state level, I think, generally speaking, the election deniers did not do very well in the governors, in the attorney generals, and the secretary of state races, which means hopefully they will mainly not be in a position to do mischief, to meddle, to try to overturn state level election results, especially since they did not do well in states that are purple states, contested states, where there might actually be some opportunity to influence or do mischief. Another thing that I think is worth emphasizing when we look at the issues that were perhaps influential in this election, abortion. And here I want to emphasize, right? We look at these states, right? Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. They are all states in which there was a possibility, if Republicans won complete control of the legislature and the governorship, if Republicans won complete control of Congress, that they would lose access to abortion, right? And in those states, voters in exit polls, so take it with a grain of salt, but what we know so far is that they ranked abortion as an important issue, right? And in some of these states, it was a little bit less important than inflation, but in some of these states, it was actually significantly more important than inflation. And I believe in all of these states, it's more important than crime, which was one of the central issues for the Republicans. So we're now beginning to get a little bit deeper into the question of why this election didn't go in the way that models and polls and many politicians predicted that it would. And it does appear that abortion was important. I think another really important thing to just notice is that the candidates most strongly identified with QAnon, with this crazy conspiracy theory that suggests that the Democratic Party is controlled by pedophile, Satan worshiping, behind the scenes officials, those politicians are suffering. I think we have, again, to be careful to say it's because they're QAnon crazy that they are doing poorly, but there does seem to be a real correlation here, right? And Lauren Boebert, it's going to go to recount. She has this tiny little sliver of a lead right now. Marjorie Taylor Greene did win re-election, will probably be very powerful within the Republican caucus for the next couple of years, but she actually lost support in her very red district. And in Ohio, one of the really strong advocates of the QAnon theory, look at the amount that his support eroded, 16 points, and he lost the election, one of the seats the Democrats flipped. So with that overview, let me start with some questions. And I'm going to pose these as questions, but I'm going to offer preliminary answers as well. And I really do welcome your comments at any point. I do think we're all still trying to figure this out. So please unmute yourself. Please put anything in the chat, however it makes sense for you to participate whenever you want to. How calcified or frozen is the electorate? And so you may know there's a workout by Lynn Vavreck and John Sides, UCLA and University of Maryland, who suggests this is the big story about the American electorate. We have become simply frozen in our political identities. And I want to say, yes, that's absolutely right. And let me show you for a moment a diagram that bears this out. And it's this map, right, of the Senate elections. And what I want you to see, right, the shift in margin. So there are some places like Florida and Alabama and South Carolina and Kansas that shifted a little bit to the right. The blue arrows show shifts in the Democratic direction. And obviously, Pennsylvania had a little bit of a shift in the Democratic direction. Kentucky, which had an important abortion ballot initiative on the ballot, had a little bit of a shift. But I think the thing that is striking about this diagram is how little movement there is in most of the states, right? And so that suggests an electorate that is quite set in its ways, dyed in the wool in terms of its partisan identities. Having said all of that, I'm also going to suggest there were some really important shifts in this election. So Democrats caring more about abortion than Republicans, a greater turnout of women than men, women voting, it looks like 18 percentage point more for Democrats. The younger voters, Generation Z voters, starting to turn out. And in particular, one of the things that often happens in a midterm is that the party that won the last election, those voters are pretty satisfied with the way things stand, and they tend to stay home, not vote at the same rate as the party that feels shut out and therefore really wants to try to regain power. That did not happen, right? Democrats really turned out. The turnout rate in this election, which is a midterm election, generally speaking, low turnout, was almost the kind of turnout you see in a presidential election. So some ambivalent evidence here. How sensitive are election outcomes to minor variations in the state of American society? And again, the Vavreck and Sides literature suggests, look, what's really happening in our elections is, 49% of the electorate on both sides is set. They know what they're going to do, and it doesn't matter how the campaign goes or what happens in society. they're going to vote because their identity is of this partisan caste. And then there's maybe 2%, maybe 5% of the electorate who actually changes a little bit of electoral cycle to electoral cycle, but they tend to make up their mind based on minor variations in things like the price of gas, the price of food, the rent they have to pay, their wages, their employment, their health. And so if that's right, and that's what these fundamental models focus on, this should have been a red wave election. And so there's some evidence that maybe actually things are a little bit different in 2022 than they have been for much of the last decade. And that gets us to a third question. How much did candidate quality matter? And let me show you a little bit more data here, which I think helps with this. So look at the difference between Brian Kemp and Herschel Walker in Georgia, right? Brian Kemp, I imagine many of us favored Stacey Abrams, but Stacey Abrams, on all accounts, didn't run a great campaign. And on the other hand, Brian Kemp proved himself to be a reasonably competent governor in the way in which he handled COVID, but also in the way in which he handled Trump's allegations of fraud in the Georgia election in 2020. And so Kemp got rewarded for competence. And on the other hand, Herschel Walker, total political novice, obviously dogged by controversy and scandal, but also just not particularly persuasive on the issues, was punished. And so that's related to this question. Sorry, let me get back to the right slide. How much did candidate quality matter? It appears to have mattered a lot. And that suggests maybe the electorate is a little less frozen, is a little, not just paying attention to what's happening in society, but also evaluating their candidates on the merit. And the ticket splitting behavior, which I'll come back to, voting for Kemp, but not for Walker in Georgia, suggests that these identities are maybe coming unstuck just a little bit. All right, so was this election a referendum on Trump and MAGA Republicans? And I think many people want to read it that way, want to say, as David Brooks said, the fever is finally breaking. As Lynn Cheney said, victory for Team Normal. I don't think that's accurate. And to be as clear as possible, remember those 220 election deniers who won, right? Look at the fact that the Republicans are extremely likely to have recaptured the House of Representatives. And so this was not the kind of decisive disavowal of Trump by the electorate that would really wound him and really suggest we are over this charismatic but incredibly polarizing, and as far as many of us are concerned, deeply destructive, anti-democratic politician being the leader of one of our two main parties. Many of us had hoped for something like that, but I don't think in terms of the impact of what just happened, that is likely to be the outcome of 2022. And the reason is simple, which is that structurally, on the one hand, it's still very difficult to win a primary in the Republican Party without either Trump's support or the support, at least, of the people who like Trump. You have to parrot him sufficiently to appeal to the Trump voters, right? That they are still the core constituency who tends to turn out in the primary votes. And second of all, I don't think in terms of electoral math, there is a party to victory in national elections for the Republican Party if the Trump voters don't come out, right? And so that puts Trump in the kingmaker seat in the primaries and in a very powerful seat in national electoral politics as well. And so to now, talk a little bit less about Trump the individual and a little bit more institutionally about the Republican Party, the drift of the Republican Party into an ethno-racial authoritarian kind of populism, into denying that elections really have the outcomes that they have if you lose them, into a kind of white nationalism, into an effort to target immigrants, etc., is that perhaps no longer as powerful in the aftermath of this 2022 election? And again, I want to suggest no, that unfortunately, this election result, although it does show that Trump, right, is not that popular. We knew that coming into this election. His approval rating is even lower than Joe Biden's. And so having said that, right, particularly when he chooses or endorses poor quality candidates, Trump is not going to be able to get them over the finish line. But can the Republican Party win if it doesn't continue in the direction that Trump indicates? It's not as if Trump is doing this by himself. He is responding to a deep-seated appetite for this kind of politics. It's happening everywhere in the democratic world. It's anti-global, it's anti-elite, it's anti-immigrant, it's anti-liberal, and it is a winning formula for getting 30 to 40% of the population to support you. And the Republicans can't win without that support. So I think in both these questions, they're a little bit different, but the answer is the same for structural reasons. Ethno-racial authoritarian populism and Trump did not carry the day in 2022, but that doesn't mean they're over and done with. How much did abortion matter for this election, and in what way? I've already shown you the evidence that it mattered where abortion access was in jeopardy. And so it mattered probably less in New York. And as we're seeing, right, probably the outcome of the vote in Congress is going to be determined by the fact that New York's gerrymandered congressional map got thrown out in court and replaced by a map that actually was much less favorable to the Democrats. In a sense, the judge kind of punished the Democrats for gerrymandering their map. A really, I think, short-sighted, punitive gerrymander in New Jersey, which took votes away from a close purple district and put them, Democratic votes, into some very safe blue districts. That's going to damage the Democrats. And then the highly gerrymandered map that was upheld by a court, thanks to recent Supreme Court decisions in Florida, that's probably going to be the margin in the House, right? And maybe we shouldn't be surprised about that. Having said that, abortion probably didn't matter very much to voters in New York. And that's part of the reason that we're going to get this outcome in New York, right? But abortion did matter where people really thought the right could be taken away. How did it matter? In what way did it matter? And there, I think there's a really important issue. And I actually find this slide a little bit misleading in that it says, well, did you care about inflation more or abortion more or crime more? As if these were all similar issues, apples, 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 right? And I want to suggest that abortion may be an orange. It may be a qualitatively different issue, at least for some voters. For some women, the question of access to abortion is not just merely an issue that they care about. It is an expression of whether or not they have full, equal rights within our society. If our Constitution protects their procreative freedom and their equal standing. And that when people begin to campaign on the basis or to vote, make up their minds politically on the basis of whether or not they're going to have equal rights, they begin to think differently, to care in a different way, to become more deliberative, more mobilized. And so, like I say, it's really early and really hard to try to figure this out. But I do think it's a really important question. In what way did abortion matter for the people who voted on the basis of it or prioritized it? Was it just another issue, or is it a fundamental shift into a different way of thinking about American politics in the way, say, that civil rights mattered for African Americans and their allies in the 1950s and 1960s in American politics? That's a deeper form of political engagement, a deeper tapping into people's sense of justice and entitlement, rights, and democracy than how much do I care about inflation? What does this election mean for 2024? Let me start on the Republican side. One of the things I haven't talked very much about is that Ron DeSantis did very well in Florida, did very well among Latino voters in Florida. And so it certainly increases his stock going into 2024. And he's already been obviously exploring a presidential campaign. On the other hand, I don't think it substantially damaged Donald Trump. And frankly, the fact that Donald Trump is under multiple forms of criminal investigation, I think increases the likelihood that Trump will declare for the presidency, and that the Republican Party will have a hard time excluding him given the way their primaries are structured, right? And so for 2024, I suspect we're going to see two candidates in, let's call it, the Trump lane in the primary contest for the presidency. I do have to be careful. This is very long ways away. A couple years is a couple eternities in American politics. For all we know, Donald Trump may be in jail by the time 2024 comes around. I doubt it. I think his, technique of constantly delaying makes it unlikely that he would be convicted by 2024, but there's a possibility. But having said that, I think we should anticipate that there will be two strong MAGA politicians in the Republican primary, and just wonder whether that opens a potential lane for another candidate, somebody like Nikki Haley, who is not in the Trump mold. On the Democratic side, I think the fact that the Democrats did reasonably well means that Joe Biden leaves this election cycle without having been seriously wounded, and therefore also potentially quite credible, perhaps someone who could prevent a primary challenge if he decides to run. And so that's just a little bit of speculation about the implications of 2022 for 2024. Now oh boy, I just got a notice that my internet connection is unstable. Are you hearing me okay? No.
Yeah, it blocked for a second, but it's okay now.
Okay, thank you. And let me just look. Yeah, I'm sorry. I this happens sometimes. My computer shifts. Give me one moment. Okay, that should be better going forward, I hope. You hearing me okay now? Okay, I'm frozen, right? Are you hearing me okay now?
Not hearing you now.
Now, how about now? I think I just switched over to the better channel. Is it working better now?
Neither one are particularly good. I mean, that stop, we don't hear you. It's really off and on. I mean, unintelligibly.
Okay, John. And I think I'm in the process of fixing it. And I can see everybody's head moving now. So I'm thinking that it's gotten better. Are you hearing me better now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. And how long had I been coming in and out?
A minute and a half or so.
Okay, so I noticed it pretty much when it started to happen. Is that right? So let me, because we're short on time, just ask one more question. Did the electorate send a message to the Supreme Court? Did we say to the arch conservative supermajority, stop it, right? And to be clear, right, some pretty red states, Kentucky and Kansas, refused to put abortion bans into their constitution, or to say that their constitution didn't protect abortion. Michigan, similarly, a more purple state, but with a really strong pro-life constituency, affirmed abortion rights. And it appears right in those 4 states where we get a Democratic trifecta that abortion was really important in determining those outcomes. But I don't think that what we saw in 2022 is the kind of results that the Democrats got in the 1930s when the Supreme Court was getting in the way of the New Deal, and the Democratic Party returned super majorities in both houses of Congress and kept the presidency. And frankly, I don't know even if that would change the mind of the conservatives in the Supreme Court. So I expect that the conservatives will continue to be very aggressive. Supremacists claim that they get to dictate what the Constitution means, that it's their bailiwick and they're going to do with it what they want, that it's going to take a more decisive repudiation of them from the electorate, more consistent and successive elections. And I don't know if that's coming or not, but I'm pretty sure 2022 didn't do it. So let's talk about what 2022 didn't do, and then a little bit about what it did do in order to set up a kind of initial framework for thinking about what we saw in this election. Congress, and this is the first thing that didn't happen, Congress hasn't been taken over by an obstructionist party so bent on dismantling Biden's legislative agenda that it would use the debt ceiling, right? We have a debt ceiling, a need to raise the debt ceiling in order to be able to pay off our bonds. That's coming up in a few months. There are Republicans campaigning for Congress who say they dislike the Inflation Reduction Act, in particular increased enforcement in the Internal Revenue Service, so much that they would refuse to preserve the good faith and credit of the United States unless the Inflation Reduction Act is repealed, right? That's not going to happen. I don't see that happening in 2023 as a result of the 2022 election. Similarly, I think it's much less likely that we're going to get an impeachment proceeding against Joe Biden or constant investigations, though I suspect there will be some investigations in the House of Representatives, assuming Republicans gain control of it, for instance, of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, maybe of Hunter Biden as well. We also didn't get officials hostile to accurately registering electoral results, election deniers, taking over the administration of elections in states and areas where they could determine the outcomes even against the popular majority, right? So 2 really important things that didn't happen in this election. It's worthwhile noting the American electorate also didn't decisively repudiate the drift of the Republican Party. That may have dragged down some candidates, but it seems every bit as likely that it was that they were just bad candidates as opposed to that they were cast in the Trumpian mold, people spreading disinformation and racism. Fourth thing that didn't happen is that Biden didn't suffer a career-ending defeat, right? That he doesn't leave this election deeply wounded. Despite his unpopularity, his party actually did better than party has done in this position for at least 20 and maybe many more years than that. Another thing that didn't happen is that the Trump-backed candidates had such a mixed record that it really doesn't clarify the former president's standing in the Republican Party's future. Is he still the kingmaker, the most important politician in the Republican Party? I don't think 2022 helps to clarify that really for us. The people also didn't send a decisive message against the Supreme Court. And then finally, and this is, I think, perhaps the most important thing from my point of view, which is that the needle really didn't move on the paralyzing parity in American politics and radical negative partisanship. I already showed you, right, one map on this, right, that this shows you really not a lot of movement. Let me now bring in Frances Lee of Princeton. I've spoken with you a little bit before about her work in secure majorities. And what Lee shows, and you could argue this goes back before the 1860s, but she starts with the 1860s for the modern period of partisanship when we have the Republican and Democratic parties as the two main parties in the United States. We've had two periods of partisan dominance. From the 1860s through the 1920s, the Republicans are dominant. From the 1930s through the 1970s, the Democrats are dominant. And then the current period, which is a period of partisan parity. And in periods of partisan parity, the incentives for politicians are different than they are in periods of partisan dominance. In periods of partisan dominance, politicians want to get reelected, but then they want to get down to the business of governing. There's no chance that they're going to shift their party from being in the minority to being in the majority. The majority party is dominant, and they just want to get about getting as much done as they can get done to benefit their constituents so that they can win themselves, the next election. In periods of partisan parity, a new priority enters politicians' calculus, and that is that they might just be able to win the majority in the next election. And that leads them often to want to obstruct what the party in power is doing in order to not give them any wins so that the party that is currently in the minority can win in the next election. And so this period of partisan parity has also been a period of legislative paralysis in Congress, and I don't see this election budging those issues at all. Finally, what did happen in this election, right? And that is that we have shown, we've seen that abortion matters. And I believe that constitutional issues matter. And so, right, this is the framework. I started this whole, right, 7-week series we're in the middle of now on. And that is the question of whether or not 2022 would be an election in which American politics started a constitutional conversation. Abortion could be one aspect of that conversation. Another aspect would be, as Joe Biden said again and again, that democracy is on the ballot because one of the two parties is increasingly turning against the full and equal representation of all citizens, irrespective of race, of country of origin, of ideology, right? And that is a different kind of issue and a different kind of politics. I think 2022 lends some credence to the idea that voters didn't just vote, as standard models of fundamental issues suggest that they would. This is as much a hope as a clearly supported conclusion. We just don't have enough evidence yet. We don't have a window into voters' ideas, opinions, judgment. We just have what they did at the ballot box. But what they did at the ballot box was hard to predict on the basis of voting on narrow, self-interested, ordinary kinds of partisan stances. And so it does seem like this election showed that these constitutional issues matter for the outcome of elections. They also show that candidate quality matters, at least in some races. I started to show you some of the evidence of this, having relevant qualifications, being willing to disavow crazy ideas, right? And so, right, we see this in Georgia, we see this in Pennsylvania, we see this with Walker versus Kemp, right? The idea that people were willing to split their tickets, to say, if there's a good qualified candidate from the party I prefer, I'll vote for them. But if my party puts up somebody with little experience or seems kind of crazy or is plagued by scandals, I'm not going to vote for them. That didn't hold across the board, but it held a lot. And the result is you get a lot of what's called ticket splitting, which suggests perhaps there's a little bit of thawing of the purely frozen partisan behavior that has been characteristic of recent elections. So this election appears to have reintroduced ticket splitting in some places, which might just reduce the hold of partisan identity thinking. We're certainly not to any kind of realignment, any kind of real tidal wave in our politics, but at least we're seeing a little bit of a thaw. All right, why don't I stop there? And I imagine you guys have things you want to say. John's first out of the gate. Go ahead, John.
Thanks. That was very good analysis, but one minor point is that actually the pundits did horrible in forecasting this election, but the polls did very well. In fact, there's an article in the New Yorker this week, I guess just online, by Isaac Treutner, on how good the polls were this week. They got very close on a lot of things where other people, the newspapers were predicting different things. The more important point is, I kind of disagree with you about whether Trump has been weakened, because I think a big factor in Trump's success all along was that establishment Republicans, and they haven't altogether gone away, they're still around and they still in influential positions. I mean, Mitch McConnell, starting with Mitch McConnell, but establishment Republicans used to think that we really cannot deal with Trump at all. We really just have to go along with this red wave or we'll go under ourselves, which happened to some people. But I think that argument looks way weaker now. And a lot of establishment Republicans who never liked him, of course, but now they think, gee, we can really, get away from him and even oppose him without running the kind of dangers that we thought we did.
Yeah, and so that might reduce Trump's capacity to bully establishment Republicans into submission. And that is important, obviously, right? And so maybe let's call it the Mitt Romney wing of the party or the Mitch McConnell wing of the party, right? Ideologically conservative, but not attracted to the ethno-racial and disinformational side of Trump, right? That they might start regaining some confidence. And I think that would be good for the Republican Party. What I don't see is a turn between 2022 and 2024 in which those kinds of candidates, if they're not already in office, become more viable in Republican Party primaries. So if they're incumbents, maybe they're more viable, maybe they're more independent and fear Trump's punishment less. But please note, right, that almost every Republican member of Congress who voted to impeach Trump is no longer in Congress, right? Because he still has that hold on primary voters, right? Please note, although his candidates didn't have a great track record in the general election, he still strongly influenced who got to run in the general election due to his influence on primaries. So that's your second point, John. The first point about the polls, I guess I want to be careful about cherry picking polls. And so, yes, polls did better than fundamental models. And in a sense that's unusual in 2022. Having said that, if you look at some of the polls that are, I shouldn't say polls, some of the models that are poll aggregating, right? So Politico has one, 538 has one, New York Times has one. And they all showed that the Republicans had about an 80% chance of winning the Senate in their final resting place before the votes started to be counted, right? And that seems to me, obviously, who knows, maybe it'll turn out to be right that the Republicans control the Senate, but it doesn't look like they had an 80% chance of winning, right? And so I think even the polls missed something. And by the way, the polls, missed last time and missed in 2016. And so the pollsters are trying to correct, and here we just have to be careful, right? On the one hand, what's the response rate for polls? Pollsters are really happy when 10% of the people they're trying to reach actually answer the phone and talk to them, right? And on the other hand, how serious and revealing are people when they talk to a pollster? How many people are just distracted, making dinner, as they say, or misrepresenting themselves deliberately to pollsters? So I think there are good reasons to think that polling is a really imprecise art, not a science in the current moment. Do you want to push back on that at all, John? Give you the opportunity if you want it. You are muted.
I'd like to push back on it.
Okay, Bob, go ahead.
The aggregate polls were off, and I understand largely because they were contaminated by Republican-oriented polls that they just a bunch of garbage polls had to be included in the aggregates and therefore skewed the results. And one other point, not a poll, but the one person that I know of that predicted this was Michael Moore.
Uh-huh.
So, and he also predicted Trump's win too. So
I was about to say he's got a pretty good track record.
Yeah.
And
has his hand on the pulse of the nation.
And so let's not have a purely academic conversation. And I take your point, Bob, about the aggregate polls are only as good as the polls they aggregate, right? But my emphasis, I guess, in thinking that both the models and the polls didn't do as well as the people who designed them hope they will do, is that the electorate behaved in a somewhat different way than the models are built on, right? And that's this idea that as opposed to paying exclusive attention to inflation or to what you think your economic prospects are or how you think the president performed economically over the last couple of years, that's reflected in the popularity of the president, which is very low, right? Among the lowest. That's reflected in consumer confidence, which is very low, as bad as it was in 2008. People didn't necessarily vote in that way. And that's where I think there might just be something important going on in a shift in electoral orientation and a shift in the way people are thinking about the decisions they're making in elections. Maybe Michael Moore has a better feel for this. than what the polls are picking up. Yeah, thanks, Bob. Did you want to say anything else?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Flossie, go ahead.
I think it's very difficult to be somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene and suffer one moment of doubt. In other words, the change that I would be hoping for is that it would be a questioning of the self. That's very hard to happen. If a Democrat questions himself, herself, he may decide not to vote. But somebody coming up from the Tea Party is not going to question motives. He's going to hang on to what he feels is right because it's his side.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
And I'm not a good enough psychologist or empath to get inside the head of a Marjorie Taylor Greene or a Donald Trump.
But I'm stupid enough
to try, but yes, I do think, and I guess part of what I'm wondering is how fragile is the underlying ego to not be able to ever question anything, right? But I also I do think, you know, we're at this historical moment where we don't have to focus on the Greens and the Trumps of the world. We can focus on the average voter and how the term that political science is using, yes, calcified, frozen, rigid are we in our political identities such that we can't even hear the evidence. Yes, by the way, today I just got my bivalent COVID vaccine. I hope all of you have. I had COVID a little bit more than a month ago, so I waited a little while. But people who can't hear the evidence about vaccines working, right? Who are therefore dying at higher rates because their political identities suggest to them, perhaps also their masculinist sexual identity, that this is just elite gobbledygook and that we're not going to listen to that liberal nonsense, right? That's a really strange world in which not only, you know, you expect a certain number of narcissists to enter politics. My partner is rewatching House of Cards right now, and that's a pretty good theory of why a lot of people go into politics, right? But having said that, it's not just the politicians. It's a lot of us these days who've become so intransigent, so completely dug in and so non-responsive to facts. And I guess I see in the ticket splitting a little bit of hope in 2022 that some of us are coming a little bit, you know, unfrozen in the way we conceive our political identities and its implication for our political behavior. Make sense? Yeah. I don't want to suggest Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to get there or Donald Trump is going to get there, but if another 5% of the electorate gets there, that's good news. Anybody else?
Kids love their cars more than they love anything else.
Who do?
The teenager, the average. They're the ones. They're the rebellious ones.
Yeah, and
they had the vote and they didn't use it.
Well, we'll have to see. I think that maybe young people did vote in this election and that they voted dominantly Democratic. At least they voted higher than there was more of a youth vote than there are in typical midterm elections, and it did break in the Democratic direction, if you believe the exit polls, which we have to take with a grain of salt. By the way, Flossie,
yes,
I think there are a whole bunch of kids these days who don't care about driving anymore. Less identified.
They're the ones who are
maybe it's
global warming.
Maybe it's just that I'm in New York City. That could be part of what's determining it. David, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in defense of the younger generation, not only was there an unexpected turnout in that group on issues of climate change, I think they're way ahead of the rest of us in terms of positive political action and thinking through the issues in a very rational and evidence-based way. So I'm optimistic that there might be the beginnings of a movement amongst the teenagers and 20-somethings.
And that might be part of the reason they're not quite as into their cars as they would have been a generation or two ago.
But this is California that we're thinking of. I'm thinking of kids in the South.
Yes.
And mothers for liberty. They don't want their kids to think about anything that will hurt them. They want their kids to be happy.
Well,
and
everybody wants their
them
kids
reading certain books. So, yeah. Happy world.
Yes. Well. Okay. David, do you have your hand up again, or is that?
I just wanted to say that Flossie's right about those sources of resistance. There's a good article in last week's New Yorker about the demise of the wit and wisdom curriculum throughout conservative parts of the country, but that's on adults. It's not on the kids, and surely there's an influence there. But I think there's also, I'm hoping there's also an elements of defiance and throw the old farts out so we can take over. So,
and I think you're absolutely right about climate change, David, which is, if you are coming of age in a generation where it's not clear that the planet will be habitable at the time you reach the age of your grandparents, if it's not clear that therefore it's that in good conscience you can have a child, right? Because you may be bringing them into a world that's going to experience not only ecological, but also civilizational collapse. That sobers you up pretty damn fast, right? And maybe you stop caring so much about cars and boys and girls and care a little bit more about.
You have to have a good teacher do that for you.
Yeah. Well,
coming from your home, yes.
You can get it in the right corners of the internet these days as well. All right, everybody. Good being with you as always. Take care. Big sigh of relief. I think we get to all breathe collectively, and I'll continue the conversation. I think we'll go back to thinking about international relations. A lot has happened in the Ukraine. A lot is happening in China. Obviously, there's a international climate change conference happening right now also. So look forward to speaking with you again next week. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you, David.
Bye.